The ivory silk of Isla Moreau's wedding dress rustled as she stepped into the grand foyer of St. Augustine's chapel, her heart thrumming in her chest. The moment she had been waiting for, dreaming of, was only minutes away. The hushed whispers of her bridesmaids, the final adjustments to her veil, the faint scent of lilies in the air, it was perfect. And yet, something felt wrong. A cold shiver traced her spine, the sensation of being watched creeping over her skin like a ghostly caress. She barely had time to turn before a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. Isla's scream was swallowed whole by the thick fabric, her body lifted effortlessly off the ground. The walls of the dimly lit corridor blurred as she kicked, fought, tried to free herself, but her captor was a fortress of muscle and restraint. A deep, accented voice murmured against her ear. "Don't fight, princess. You'll only make this harder for yourself." Terror clawed at her throat. This was no drunken mistake or prank from an overeager groomsman. These men, dressed in black, faces masked, had a purpose. And that purpose was her. She was shoved into a sleek black car before she could react, her veil ripped away and tossed to the floor like an afterthought. The moment the door slammed shut, Isla launched herself at the handle, only to find it locked. Her breath came in frantic bursts as she twisted in her seat, eyes narrowing on the man seated across from her. He was calm. Too calm. His sharp jaw was shadowed with dark stubble, his lips pressed into a firm, unreadable line. Midnight black hair tousled in an almost deliberate way framed a face that was too beautiful for a man who clearly belonged to the underworld. The navy blue dress shirt he wore was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing strong, veined hands resting casually on his thighs. He radiated danger and power, as if the air around him bent to his will. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. Icy blue. Piercing. Watching her with a possessive heat that sent conflicting shivers through her. "Who the hell are you?" Isla spat, her voice edged with fury. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her. The way her chest heaved with panic, the way the delicate lace of her wedding gown hugged her curves. The way she should have looked at her groom today, but was now trapped in a car with a stranger instead. Finally, his lips curved into something dangerous. "I am the man who just saved your life." Isla's blood turned to ice. "What, you were about to marry a liar?" He leaned forward, his powerful body exuding an intoxicating mix of authority and heat. "Your fiancé isn't the man you think he is, princess. He planned this entire thing." Her pulse pounded violently against her skin. Lies. This had to be a lie. Daniel, her Daniel, would never. The stranger reached into his pocket and tossed a small envelope onto the leather seat beside her. Isla hesitated before picking it up, her fingers shaking as she pulled out a handful of photographs. Her breath hitched. In one, Daniel sat in a dimly lit club, laughing with a man she didn't recognize, cash exchanging hands. In another, he stood outside what appeared to be a seedy underground poker room, eyes wild, desperate. And then there was the last picture. Daniel. In a meeting with this man. Her heart stopped. She looked up, horror coiling inside her. "What is this?" His smirk was slow. "Lethal. Proof. No. No, this couldn't be real." She had spent years with Daniel. She knew him. He wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a monster either. She shoved the photos back at the man, her body trembling with disbelief. "You're lying." He let out a low chuckle, the sound brushing over her skin like silk and steel. "You'll see the truth soon enough." His gaze darkened, raking over her in a way that sent a forbidden thrill through her. "Until then, you belong to me." Her stomach clenched, a mix of fear and something far more dangerous twisting inside her. Isla should have been terrified. Instead, as she stared at the man who had just stolen her from the life she thought she knew, a different kind of heat pooled low in her belly. And that terrified her far more than anything else. The car moved smoothly through the city streets, but inside, Isla's world was spinning. She sat stiffly, her heart pounding against her ribs as she gripped the wedding dress bunched in her lap. Her body screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something, but the man sitting across from her, with those icy blue eyes and that commanding presence, made it clear she wasn't going anywhere. She swallowed hard, forcing steel into her voice. "I don't belong to you." Luca DeLuca's lips quirked, amusement flashing across his ruggedly handsome face. "You do now." His arrogance made her blood boil. She had spent years shaping her own life, refusing to let the expectations of her powerful family define her. And now, she was being claimed like some possession by a man who oozed danger and dominance. She forced herself to hold his gaze. "Where are you taking me?" His fingers drummed idly against the leather seat beside him, as if he had all the time in the world. "Somewhere safe." Safe. She nearly laughed. Kidnapping a woman from her wedding day doesn't exactly scream safe, she bit out, her anger finally overtaking the raw fear thrumming through her. "If you have some twisted vendetta against Daniel, leave me out of it." Luca leaned forward, the air in the car shifting with the slow, predatory way he moved. "You are the reason I'm involved, princess." His voice was smooth, like velvet laced with something dark and unyielding. "Your fiancé is drowning in debt. He's been borrowing from the wrong people. Stealing from his company. And now he's desperate." She shook her head, gripping the fabric of her dress as though it could tether her to the reality she wanted to believe in. "I don't." "He was going to fake your kidnapping." The words landed like a slap. Her breath stilled. Luca studied her, watching the truth sink into her veins like poison. "You think I'm your enemy, but I'm the one who stopped you from getting played like a fool." He sat back again, stretching one arm over the seat as if he was completely at ease. "He needed the ransom money from your father to cover his debts. You were just another bargaining chip in his game." "No. It wasn't true. It couldn't be true." She opened her mouth to argue, to tell him he was lying, but the photograph still burned in her mind. Daniel at the club, Daniel exchanging money, Daniel sitting across from this very man. Her stomach twisted. "Why would you care?" she whispered, her voice quieter now. "Why interfere at all?" Luca's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his expression. Something deeper. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket. Isla's breath caught in her throat. She knew that locket. It was hers, one she had lost years ago. She stared at it, her pulse hammering. "Where did you get that?" He rolled it between his fingers before flipping it open, revealing the tiny photograph inside, an old picture of her, one she had taken when she was younger. "You saved my life once, Isla." His voice was lower now, rougher. "You don't remember, do you?" Her mind raced, but nothing came to her. Luca let the locket snap shut and met her gaze. "Years ago, you found me bleeding out in an alley. You didn't know who I was. You didn't care. You called for help, held pressure on my wound, stayed with me when you could have walked away." A sharp inhale left her lips. The memory was distant, foggy, but real. She had been leaving a coffee shop late one night when she stumbled across a man slumped against a brick wall, his dark clothing soaked in blood. She had stayed, called an ambulance, kept talking to him even when he barely responded. She had never known who he was. But he had known who she was. Luca's voice was almost a whisper now, though the steel never left it. "You saved me, princess. And I don't forget debts." Her breath came fast, her chest rising and falling beneath the delicate lace of her wedding gown. Everything was happening too fast. One minute, she was supposed to be walking down the aisle to marry the man she thought she loved. The next, she was being stolen away by a mafia boss who claimed he was protecting her. And now, she was staring at a man who had been watching over her far longer than she ever realized. A shiver ran down her spine, but it wasn't from fear this time. Luca leaned closer, and she sucked in a breath, caught in the electric pull between them. His voice was low, a dark promise that curled around her like silk. So tell me, Isla. His fingers reached out, brushing the loose strands of hair from her cheek. His touch was light, but it burned. Do you still think I'm the villain in your story? Her pulse thundered. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But as she stared into those piercing blue eyes, she realized something even more dangerous than her situation. She wasn't just his captive. She was drawn to him. And she wasn't sure she wanted to escape. The car ride stretched into a silence so thick it was suffocating. Isla kept her eyes on the passing city lights outside the tinted window, but she wasn't really seeing them. Her thoughts were a tangled mess, caught between disbelief, betrayal, and something far more dangerous, desire. She should have been terrified. Furious. Desperate to escape. Instead, she was sitting in the back of a luxury car with a Mafia boss who had stolen her from the altar. And the worst part? Her body wasn't fighting him. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her skin still tingling where his fingers had brushed her cheek. She could feel Luca watching her, his gaze as heavy as the weight pressing in on her lungs. Finally, she forced herself to speak. What happens now? Luca exhaled, as if he'd been waiting for that question. Now? He shifted in his seat, the rich scent of leather and spice surrounding her as he leaned forward. Now you see the truth. She turned to face him, ignoring the way her stomach tightened at his closeness. And what exactly does that mean? Luca's lips curled into something between a smirk and a promise. It means, princess, that until you understand just how deep your fiancé's betrayal runs, you're staying with me. A sharp prickle of heat shot through her veins. Her chin lifted defiantly. You mean I'm your prisoner? His gaze flickered with something unreadable before he reached into his jacket pocket. For a split second, she thought he might pull out a weapon, but instead, he held up a small, sleek key. He twirled it between his fingers before tossing it onto the seat between them. Doors unlocked, he murmured. You can walk the moment we stop. Her breath caught. A game. He was playing with her. Her fingers twitched at her side. Should she call his bluff? Should she actually run? But then she imagined the alternative, walking back into her life, back to Daniel, back to the web of lies she had been so blind to. Luca studied her, his sharp blue eyes knowing. Daring her to decide. When the car finally pulled to a stop, the moment stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. Isla swallowed hard. Then she curled her fingers into her lap, keeping them far away from the key. Luca's smirk deepened, but there was something else in his expression, satisfaction. Like he had expected this outcome. The back door swung open, and one of Luca's men stood waiting. Boss. The man gave a slight nod, his gaze flickering briefly to Isla before returning to Luca. Everything's ready. Luca stepped out first, then turned, offering his hand to her. She hesitated. She shouldn't take it. But she did. The moment her fingers slid into his, a rush of warmth spread through her body. His grip was strong, confident, as he helped her out of the car. The estate before her was breathtaking. A sprawling villa nestled into the hills, surrounded by towering iron gates and high walls. It was beautiful in a dark, untouchable way, much like the man standing beside her. She shivered as the cool night air kissed her exposed skin, the delicate lace of her wedding dress feeling out of place in such a dangerous setting. Luca, still holding her hand, pulled her closer. You're cold, he murmured. Before she could protest, he shrugged off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The heat of his body lingered in the fabric, wrapping around her like an embrace. The unexpected gesture sent a ripple of warmth through her. This man, this criminal, was treating her with more care than the man she had almost married. And that realization was more terrifying than anything else. Her voice was quiet when she finally spoke. Why are you doing this? Luca turned his head slightly, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. Because no one else ever put you first. Her breath hitched. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the distant crash of waves against the cliffs beyond the estate. Then, his fingers traced down her arm, slow and deliberate. "Come inside, princess," he murmured, voice thick with something that made her knees weak. "You're mine now." And the worst part? She didn't want to fight him. Not anymore. Isla stepped inside the grand villa, her breath catching as she took in the sheer luxury of it. The towering ceilings, the dim golden lighting, the scent of expensive wood and leather. It was all overwhelming, yet undeniably intoxicating. She had expected coldness. Sterility. A space that mirrored the ruthless man who had taken her. Instead, it felt intimate. Luca walked ahead of her, his broad shoulders casting long shadows against the polished marble floors. His movements were effortless, dripping with power, control, dominance. She shouldn't be noticing these things. She shouldn't be feeling like this. But when he turned to face her, the heat in his piercing blue gaze sent a slow, molten pulse through her veins. He didn't speak right away. He simply studied her, the way her wedding dress still clung to her, the way her body reacted to his presence. The air between them was thick. Charged. Finally, he broke the silence. "You should change." Her heart stuttered. He reached for his collar, unbuttoning the top 2 buttons of his dress shirt before rolling up his sleeves, exposing strong, veined forearms. She swallowed hard, forcing her gaze to anywhere but him. A slow smirk curved his lips. "What's wrong, princess?" She scowled, grasping at the last remnants of her sanity. "I'm not your princess." Luca stepped closer, the scent of him, woodsy, rich, undeniably male, curling around her senses. "No?" He tilted his head slightly, brushing his knuckles over the curve of her jaw. "Then why aren't you running?" Her breath hitched. His touch was light, teasing, but it burned. She started, but her voice failed her. Because she could have run. She could have taken the key, fled the moment she stepped out of that car. But she didn't. And now she was standing in a Mafia boss's mansion, wearing a wedding dress meant for a man who had betrayed her, staring into the eyes of the man who had saved her. Luca let his hand trail down, fingers ghosting over her bare shoulder, sending shivers racing through her body. "You're trembling," he murmured. She swallowed. "I'm cold." His smirk deepened. Liar. He knew what was happening between them. He felt it too, the slow, dangerous pull of something neither of them should want. With one smooth movement, he reached out, gripping the delicate fabric of her veil before slowly pulling it from her hair. The intimacy of it sent a traitorous shiver down her spine. His eyes darkened as he took in the sight of her wedding dress still perfect, but her heart utterly wrecked. Luca lifted the veil, staring at it for a brief moment before letting it fall to the floor between them. "You're not his anymore," he murmured. "You never were." A sharp, unsteady breath left her lips. "Is that what you want?" she whispered. "To own me?" Luca's gaze flickered with something unreadable. "No," he said slowly. "I want you to choose me." Her pulse thundered. Because that was the most dangerous thing of all. Not the kidnapping. Not the betrayal. But the fact that a part of her, the part that had always craved something wild, something untamed, wanted to. The heat between them was unbearable now. Suffocating. And then he moved. A slow, deliberate step closer. Isla's breath caught as he reached out, his fingers grazing her waist, barely touching yet commanding all the same. "Tell me to stop," he murmured. She should. She should. But when his lips brushed against her ear, when his breath fanned over her skin, the only sound that left her lips was a soft, desperate gasp. His grip tightened. "You don't want me to," he whispered. And God help her, he was right. The air in the room was thick with tension, pulsing like a live wire between them. Isla should have stepped away. She should have put distance between herself and the man who had stolen her from her wedding. But she didn't. Instead, she stood still, her breath shaky as Luca's fingers ghosted over the intricate lace of her wedding gown. His touch wasn't rushed, it was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring every second. "Tell me to stop," he murmured again, his voice dark and smooth like silk. Isla's heart pounded, her body betraying her. The logical part of her screamed that this was wrong, that she was standing in the lion's den, willingly letting herself be devoured. But the rest of her, the part that had been starved for something real, something undeniable, ached to give in. Luca's fingertips trailed along the delicate strap of her gown, sending a wave of fire racing down her spine. His gaze never left hers, as if he was waiting for her to break, to surrender to the storm building between them. "You want this," he murmured, his lips inches from her ear. "You want me." A sharp inhale left her lips, her knees weakening at the husky promise in his voice. She could lie. She could fight. But the truth was already written across her skin, in the way her body reacted to his, in the way her breath stuttered when he touched her. She swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what I want." Luca chuckled softly, the sound low and knowing. His hands found her waist, and when he pulled her closer, her body molded against his like they had been made for this, for each other. He dipped his head, his lips grazing the sensitive spot just beneath her jaw. Isla shivered, her fingers instinctively curling into his shirt. "You're lying," he murmured against her skin. "But I'll let you keep pretending for now." She gasped as his teeth scraped lightly against her pulse point, teasing, taunting. The heat pooling in her belly was unbearable now, a slow burn threatening to consume her whole. His hand slid down, gripping the soft curve of her hips. He pulled her flush against him, letting her feel just how much he wanted her. "Luca," she whispered, her voice a desperate plea. He groaned, as if hearing his name from her lips undid him. "Say it again." Her fingers tightened in his shirt, her body aching, yearning. "Luca." And then he snapped. His mouth crashed against hers, claiming her in a kiss that was raw, desperate, hungry. Isla gasped against his lips, but he didn't give her a chance to think, to hesitate. His hand tangled in her hair, angling her head so he could kiss her deeper, devour her completely. Her world tilted. All her thoughts, all her resistance, gone. She melted into him, her body pressing against his, craving his heat, his strength. His tongue swept against hers, coaxing a moan from deep within her throat. Luca growled low in his chest, as if the sound ignited something even darker inside him. He lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her across the room. When her back hit the cool surface of the wall, a delicious contrast to the fire raging inside her, she gasped. Luca took the opportunity to trail his lips down her neck, his teeth grazing over her skin, claiming her with every kiss. "Mine," he muttered against her throat, his voice rough with need. "You were never his, princess. You were always meant to be mine." Her heart slammed against her ribs, a breathless mix of fear and desire tangling inside her. She should stop this. She should. But when Luca's hands traced down the curves of her body, when he looked at her like she was the only thing he wanted in the entire world, she knew there was no turning back. Not now. Not ever. Luca's body pressed against hers, his heat branding her, his hands possessive as they mapped every inch of her skin. Isla had spent so long believing she knew what love, what desire, was supposed to feel like. But this? This was fire. This was something dark and consuming, something that left her breathless and aching for more. Her fingers tangled in his hair, nails dragging against his scalp as he kissed her like he was starving for her. His hands traced down her sides, gripping the soft fabric of her wedding dress, fisting it in his hands like he wanted to rip it away. "Mine," he murmured against her lips, his voice rough with unspoken emotion. "You were always mine." The words should have scared her. But they didn't. Because deep down, she knew. Somewhere inside her, she had always craved something more, something real. Luca pulled back just enough to meet her gaze, his blue eyes dark with hunger, but there was something else there too. Something deeper. Tell me to stop, he whispered, brushing his lips against hers. Isla stared up at him, her heart hammering, her world tilting in ways she never expected. And then she gave him the only answer that mattered. I don't want you to stop. A growl rumbled in his chest, and then his mouth was on hers again, harder, more desperate, more needy. He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her through the villa like she weighed nothing, and she barely registered the luxurious surroundings as he brought her into a grand bedroom. The bed was massive, the sheets dark and inviting, but Isla barely had time to process before Luca laid her down, hovering over her with a hunger that sent shivers down her spine. His fingers traced the delicate lace of her dress, his touch reverent. I want to take this off you, he said, his voice thick. I want to erase every memory of today, except me. A delicious shudder ran through her. She didn't resist as he slowly peeled the fabric away, his movements both gentle and possessive, as if he was unwrapping something precious. The way he looked at her. God, no man had ever looked at her like that. Like she was a prize he had fought for. Like he would burn the world to keep her. Luca leaned down, his lips pressing against the curve of her shoulder, then trailing lower. You're mine, princess, he murmured, kissing his way across her skin. And I'm going to make sure you never forget it. And that night, he did exactly that. The morning after Isla stirred, her body deliciously sore, the warmth of the morning sun spilling through the open balcony doors. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. But then she felt the strong arms wrapped around her, the steady rise and fall of Luca's chest beneath her cheek, and everything came rushing back. Her breath hitched as she shifted slightly, careful not to wake him. But Luca was already awake. His grip tightened, pulling her closer against him. Running already? His voice was thick with sleep, but there was amusement in it, too. Isla bit her lip. I wasn't, he rolled them effortlessly, pinning her beneath him, his smirk downright sinful. Liar, he murmured. She shivered, remembering all the ways he had ruined her last night. But then his expression softened, and he reached up, tracing a finger down her cheek. You're free, Isla, he said quietly. You always were. Her breath caught. Because she realized, for the first time in her life, she felt free. Not because she had run. Not because she had escaped. But because she had chosen. She reached up, cupping his face, her heart swelling with something terrifying and beautiful all at once. I'm not going anywhere, she whispered. Luca's jaw tensed, and then his lips crashed against hers in a kiss that sealed her fate. She had been stolen from her wedding. But in the end, she had chosen to stay. And she had never felt more alive. The end.
Thank you so much for watching. All my stories are written by me, and I hope you enjoy them. I upload new videos daily, so I hope you'll hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. I'd also love to hear what you think about this story in the comments, and feel free to tell me what kinds of stories you'd like me to bring to the channel in the future.